Ecuador's protesters meet the president. Demonstrators discuss their demands with Guillermo Lasso. Will negotiations quell violence and instability or deepen divides? I'm Andrea Sankey, and today's newsmaker is Ecuador. For 2 weeks, Ecuador's indigenous groups have led mass protests. Frustrated by food and fuel shortages, demonstrators have virtually paralyzed the country. But on Monday, the government lifted the state of emergency, and talks to end the unrest are finally getting underway. So far, there's been no definitive agreement, but President Guillermo Lasso has made some concessions and agreed to cut the price of fuel.
I have decided to reduce the price of gasoline extra and Ecopaya's gasoline by 10 cents per gallon, and diesel will also be reduced by 10 cents per gallon. Ecuadorians who seek dialogue will find a government with an extended hand. Those that seek chaos, violence and terrorism, they will face the full extent of the law.
But that cut falls well short of protesters' demands. The 45 cents they want is more than 4 times higher than what the president is offering. The government says that demand is simply unrealistic and would do even more damage to Ecuador's already fragile economy. The question now is, can the rival sides find any consensus? Leonidas Issa leads the country's largest indigenous group. They're demanding price caps on food, as well as a significant increase in funding for education. But while there's room to negotiate on some issues, on others, Issa will not budge.
I think we've been absolutely clear. We have recognized all that has been done by the national government. We've recognized it, but we've also made clear our priority points. We've not demanded everything, just 2 things: the fuel issue and the mining and oil issue. I think we, as indigenous of multiple nations, would insist on the 2 degrees to address. We would be irresponsible according to the current political moment, the social moment, and the economical moment currently in Ecuador.
The 2-week-long protests have had a massive impact on Ecuador. At least 7 people have died during the demonstrations. Oil output has fallen by 50% and could soon stop entirely. And after devastating riots in Puyo, Ecuador's interior minister announced police could no longer guarantee the town's security. The unrest has not only damaged the country, it's also damaged the president's political capital. On the 13th day of protests, Guillermo Lasso faced a vote of no confidence. He hit back, accusing indigenous leaders of orchestrating a coup.
It has been proven that the real intention of the violence is a coup d'etat, and that is why we are calling on the international community to warn against this attempt to destabilize democracy in Ecuador.
So, is it a coup, or simply President Lasso's failures to address inequality issues even before the protest started? Joining me now to debate that and more are from Quito, writer and sociologist Inkarri Kowii. From Guayaquil, fellow with the Council on Foreign Relations and the International Crisis Group in Latin America, Nora Brito. Also from the Ecuadorian capital is journalist Matthew Carpenter-Arevalo. Thanks all so much for being with us. So the parties are talking now, but Nora, how high are your expectations? And do you at least think the worst of the instability and violence has passed?
I will forever be an optimist. And as you know, the government and the groups that have been leading the protests, CONAIE and other groups in civil society, have been speaking with the government. So I do think that's a really great sign. And now the question is if the government is negotiating in good faith. And I think in the next couple of days, we're going to see the results of that.
How do you mean negotiating in good faith? What else would be happening?
Well, CONAIE and the other groups, they have explained that they have been asking the government, they have very specific demands. As we know, there's a 10-point agenda. And they've been speaking with the government since last year. They've met with the government. They have asked the government for subsidies. Well, there's a list of their demands, and unfortunately, they have not received anything about those demands. So I think at this point, they want more than words. They want action.
Okay, fair enough. Matthew, you know, Lasso has made, I guess, certain amends, including subsidizing fertilizers, erasing some debt, cutting back on security measures. But did those efforts really just come a bit too late for protesters' needs?
Well, there's also a question to Nora's point whether or not the CONAIE is coming to the table in good faith, and whether what they're asking for is actually going to alleviate poverty. Because there are a number of ways you can see what's going on in Quito right now. If you want to believe this is an exercise in government repression, then there's content for that. If you want to believe that this is an attempt to destabilize the government, there's content for that. So when we talk about bad faith, I think there's bad faith on both sides of the table right now. But the larger question is, if the CONAIE is successful, and if we get 40 cents reduced from the price of gasoline right now, is that going to make us a less unequal country? And I question whether or not rich people receiving subsidies for their big cars is really going to help poor farmers and others who are right now protesting with the conditions under which they're living.
Very interesting. Okay, Inkarri, I just want to get your take on the two interpretations you've heard there. And do you think either side are in these talks bargaining in good faith?
I have to agree with Matthew. There are both, from both sides, they haven't been honest, truly honest, or in speaking with faith. We have to remember that Isa, since the start of the protest, he didn't want to negotiate or to sit down in a negotiation table. He have to wait more than a week to say we are going to sit with the government and negotiate. On the other side, the government, they say they will agree to negotiate, but they weren't clear. They didn't have clear signs like a place, a date, hour, methodology, a route of agreements to work on. So they haven't been fussy since the start, both sides.
Okay, interesting. And Inkarri, let me stick with you, because there's also an issue that some have raised about who is really participating in the protests themselves, and that we are seeing legitimate and largely peaceful protests actually being hijacked by more violent and destabilizing elements. To what extent do you think that's true?
I think it's true. It's true. There are people that is protesting peacefully. There are communities and leaders that they believe in what they are demanding. But there are also groups inside CONAIE, inside all the indigenous organizations that they want to appear in public scene to gain power. Remember that Isa from the 2019 protest became a key actor in national politics. So a way to get in national politics is to get advantage from this chaos. So there are individual and collective interests that they are not just trying to get a better way of life. They are fighting for gain space in national politics. And also there are groups that are interested that the government fails. So there are a lot of groups, a lot of interests, and it's very difficult to differentiate what is going on, what groups are representing the legitimate demands and the other interests. So it's very complicated.
Nora, let me ask you about that. I mean, how much are those other kind of interest groups, more nefarious interests that are playing a role here? How much are they actually distorting the legitimate cause of protesters coming out to the streets to legitimately say this kind of inequality is wrong? A lot of it has to do with government corruption and mismanagement. We need to stop it by making our demands heard. How much is that really getting drowned out by these other interests?
anytime you see violence, right, it affects the messaging, it affects the message. So I think, unfortunately, there's been the level of violence that we've seen. And it's not only now that we see this violence. For the last 2 years, there's been an increasing level of homicides in the country. And we've seen more than 300 people have died in prisons, a couple of prison riots. So this kind of violence is not new. And I think, unfortunately, because even the people that are sitting at their house watching this here in Ecuador, people are talking more about the level of violence than the overall goal of this. And I think, unfortunately for Latin America, this is not only an issue that we see in Ecuador. Social unrest is endemic to the region due to the levels of high inequality, slow growth, and now we see high inflation and the effects of the war in the region.
Right. I have to ask you more than about how much you think these criminal elements are playing a role in what's happening right now. The president actually, we'll have to remember, declared a state of emergency in 3 states just 2 months ago because of what he says were elements of crime rooted in gangs, rooted in drug trafficking. Even prison riots in the country have made broken records in Ecuador. This is something that the country had never seen before. So what role are those criminal elements actually playing in, and also again in distorting the very legitimate causes in the inequality that's being protested against here?
And as I mentioned a couple of minutes ago, it's unfortunate that the groups that are protesting right now, they have a legitimate reason why they're protesting, right? There is an increasing the cost of living. They are demanding President Lasso. He made a lot of promises during his presidential campaign, and unfortunately, most people feel that he has not delivered. So the combination of the institutional inefficiency that these groups feel, plus high inequalities, growth, unemployment has, I think what we see is a level of frustration combined with a security issue that unfortunately the government has not been able to control. And that's what we're seeing right now in the protests. People demanding change and a more equal society, but also the elements of groups of individuals that are part of the security issue and are also hijacking the protests and the messaging of this protest.
Right. I have to add a bit of my own observation. I actually lived in Ecuador for quite a time when I was in university, and I find it particularly tragic in a country like Ecuador because the country had been a sort of kind of bastion of peace in a region that was really racked with civil conflict. I mean, Colombia had decades of civil war. Peru had highly destabilizing rebel movements, including, of course, the Shining Path. Yet, even while very poor and unequal, Ecuador remained so stable and peaceful. Even during military coups, no blood was really shed. So, Matthew, I mean, has that entire dynamic completely shifted now?
Well, there are a number of different factors you have to take into account. And one of them is that when Colombia signed its peace agreement with its main rebel group, the industry of trafficking drugs through Colombia to the United States went from being a consolidated business to being a very distributed business, which right now there are a lot of dissident groups that are fighting amongst each other to control trafficking routes. And if for political reasons or other, the Colombian former traffickers didn't quite use Ecuador as much, the new dissident groups are using Ecuador quite a bit. And so the violence that we're seeing in the prisons and the violence that we're seeing on the streets, some of the horrific violence that we're seeing is very much related to different groups often acting as extensions of Mexican cartels are fighting it out. And so therefore, Ecuador is being exposed to the dynamics of the drug trade in a way that it never was before. And we have to look at the fact that gasoline is one of the main ingredients in cocaine. Many of the drug labs are along the Colombian-Ecuadorian border. So if subsidies are all of a sudden removed from gasoline, then the producers of cocaine all of a sudden have a very different economic situation that they have to affront. And so without wanting to at all disregard the very legitimate protests that are happening right now, we do have to question how these elements of the drug trade are currently influencing what's going on, and also how the former government is influencing what's going on. The first building that was attacked in Quito was the state prosecutor's building. So why would any normal protester enter into the state's prosecutor's office and start burning paperwork? somebody would do that if they were trying to destroy evidence, but a regular protester wouldn't do that. So we do have to acknowledge that these elements are there without taking our attention away from the very real problems that Ecuador is facing right now.
Right, but it has become so much more complicated. And Inkarri, let me ask you your observations from where you stand. I mean, how much has your country really changed in what essentially the problems of inequality once were, rather straightforwardly, the fight against government corruption and the marginalization of poor people and indigenous communities, to now being mixed in with corruption via drug trafficking, gangs that are now active in Ecuador? How much, again, has that dynamic shifted the entire country?
I think that the problem is indigenous communities they don't see benefits from this government or the other or past governments. There are a lot of problems that are not irresolute, and in this case, indigenous leaders, they are responsible too. CONAIE are responsible too for all the problems that we affront in indigenous communities. For example, nutrition is one of them, poverty, access of roads. We have indigenous authorities in different levels of government. We have indigenous deputies, but we somehow we don't find how to get through our demands. And we have also concentrated very much in a lot of rights that are recognized by the Constitution and some laws, but we haven't focused on how to develop the rural zones, the poor zones, the communities in Amazon, in the high Andes and the high mountains, and we don't have a solution, a model of development that help the poor people. So we have focused on rights of cultural rights, plurinational, intercultural relationship, but we don't have debated how really are the real solutions, pragmatic solutions for the economic development in the communities.
Right.
So now,
I mean, let me come back to Nora quickly, because, yeah, we're hearing what, the decades-long, centuries-even-long issues have been with the marginalization of poor communities, indigenous communities, how their crippling poverty levels have never been addressed. Development has unfairly been kind of kept from those communities. But as Matthew was saying, all this is now intertwined on a level that it never really has been before with an entirely new kind of criminal economy. That Guillermo Lasso is making very much a point of saying this is really the problem. He can say that. Still, the question is, the government is left to deal with it. Do you think this government is actually equipped to sort out this entire array of issues? Or should maybe he step aside and perhaps find someone that is better equipped to try and deal with this massive hurdle?
One of the first things, besides the demands that the groups that have asked the government, it's the justice system. The justice system in Ecuador is inefficient, unreliable, and corrupt. As we've seen the riots in the prisons, there are a number of weapons that you find in the prisons. There's managing whichever group is in control of a prison manages millions of dollars per year, because from uniforms to food to access to a cell phone, you have to pay for the services. If you want a mattress, you have to pay for the services. So right now, the government isn't able to manage a prison system. They cannot guarantee inmate safety and access to health, which is the government responsibility, since the government is, it's in charge, is responsible for the prison system and the inmates that are inside. So I think if Guillermo Lasso wants, to continue in government, he has to address not only the social issues, right, but also the security issues. And I think, the riots that we've seen, it's because of drug trafficking, and it's also society telling the government, telling politicians, please help us. You made some promises and stop breaking them.
Nora, let me ask you, I don't mean this to sound trivial. This is an honest question. If you, as someone who has analyzed this country and its politics inside and out, its history, if you had that proverbial magic wand to actually change what you would see as the political solution for Ecuador, what would you do?
I think it's urgent to address the justice system. The country will not be able to move forward if we don't address the prison riots, the corruption allegations, as the U.S. Embassy revoked visas of what they refer to narcogenerales. So you see the corruption at every level in the government and in a lot of institutions. My biggest fear is that we're going to see local elections next year, and we're going to see, money laundering, drug traffickers, investing the resources in candidates as we've seen in other countries. My also biggest fear is that, as we've seen in Brazil, criminal groups in prison managing, controlling drug trafficking routes. So I think the government, I think it should be in a state of emergency, the justice system, besides also addressing the social issues that we're seeing right now.
Matthew, it's interesting because both of you have said now that the justice system is the core, really, issue here, but we hear very little about it outside of the country. For what's covered in the international press, this is only about these protesters wanting fuel subsidies basically increased. It's so much more than that. And are you on the same page as Laura as to where, as Nora, as to where the solution actually lies?
So it's a very good point, because when we think about corruption, we tend to think of corruption referring to the siphoning of state resources to private actors. But really, corruption is also a way about determining institutional agendas. Now, we've been here talking about the president, and in our conversation, we sort of let the National Assembly off the hook, because for the last 2 years during the pandemic, they passed no significant legislation to address many of the concerns that were born of the pandemic and many of the consequences of the pandemic. And that's because they've spent a lot of their time trying to get secret deals between them to provide amnesty to past actors who are currently outside of the country because they face corruption charges. The only reason that we've know about the extent of corruption there's been in the past, oftentimes, is because these cases have borne out outside of the country. When we talk about Odebrecht, for example, that has mostly been prosecuted outside of the country. The former state national auditor is currently awaiting trial in the United States for siphoning resources. So part of the crisis that we're facing is that the institutions we have are not focused on the issues that Ecuadorians need them to address, including the justice system, because they're, as a result of corruption, they're often looking to solve other problems that are not necessarily in the best interest of the people.
Okay. Inkarri, I mean, we just have a few minutes left. Tell me what your expectations genuinely are. How hopeful are you that all the violence and the instability that we are seeing right now will actually lead to something better for Ecuador?
I'm not very optimistic in that point. I don't think that the measures and the demands that are getting agreed with the government for the indigenous movement is the solution. I think it's going to be a patch for a year. Then what are we going to do? Another protest, more subsidies. What is the solution for in the long run? So I don't think there's a plan to contain the worldwide economic crisis that is coming in the next year. So I'm not optimistic that this is going to be a solution, and we have to to get along with the other answers. We have to debate, we have to discuss the institutions of this country, even in those of, not only of the state, but those that have to represent us. The political parties, the system of political parties, do they really represent us? And how the elections are going to be in next year, that we have local elections. So I think there are a lot of things that have to be addressed.
Okay.
Not only justice, political parties, democratic system in our country have to be in debate.
Right. Nora, we just have a minute. Let me just ask you, in the immediate term, do you think this is a coup that Guillermo Lasso can survive, or will that change?
He can survive it, as we've seen there. He has released some concessions. I do see them as quick fixes to a long-term issue. But I do see the government has, as I said, they have been speaking with CONAIE and another group. So there is some willingness for the government. The question is if the repression is going to continue, and if, again, these are just more promises, are we going to see protests in the next 6 months because he has not been able to deliver on those promises?
Okay. Nora Brito, I will have to give you the last word. I'd like to thank all of my panelists so much for being with us. Inkarri Kowii and Matthew Carpenter-Arevalo. Really great to have you on the program, and our viewers, of course, as well. Remember to subscribe to our YouTube channel for much more. I'm Andrea Sankey. We'll see you next time.